There we go. Hey, welcome everyone to the last week of our Lenten study on the Bible's scandalous passages. And today we're doing the book of Revelation. And these are Revelation chapter 6 is the four horses of the apocalypse is one of the more famous passages. And these horses are famous bronze or copper horses from you can see them in Venice, but they're very well traveled. They're practically as old as the book of Revelation itself. They were originally made in Constantinople, probably from the 200s or 300s, and then were carried from Constantinople to which Constantinople was the capital of the empire at the time, and carried to Venice. And then they were on the front of St. Mark's Cathedral for a long time. And then they were brought inside now of that famous, awesome church, which is one of the coolest churches in the world if you're ever just doing tourist church things. But they're in the upstairs, and this is so when they're part of what the book of Revelation does is it takes kind of ordinary imagery and then makes it crazy. And so these are the kind of horses that they're thinking of. So that's where the background comes from. For the opening prayer, we'll just take this book is just full of prayers and praise. It's one of the underappreciated sides of it. So we'll start off with a prayer from Revelation book 11, chapter 11. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. We give you thanks, Lord God Almighty, who are and who were, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath has come, and the time for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and saints, and all who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. Amen.
Amen.
There's in that prayer, this book is very consistent. It's frankly, it's a dangerous book. It's misread a lot. It requires a careful reading of one's own cultural context, like where you are in your culture, as well as attention to the context of this ancient book. So it's a little tricky. It's appealed in any century to people who feel really alienated and suspicious of their culture, and so Christians who feel kind of out of step with America often in America will read this book very heavily. And I think as we get into this, you'll see why it's so appealing to people who feel marginalized and pushed to the side of their host culture. This book was actually, it's been much debated from the moment it came into existence. It wasn't an obvious, when they were putting together the New Testament, it wasn't an obvious includer. Like some of them, like Paul's epistle to the Romans, there's nobody who raised an objection to that, or the Gospel of Matthew, or something. Everybody agreed on things like that. This one was, people weren't so sure, but it ended up being included because it seemed to be connected to an apostle. It seemed to, with the right sort of reading, could be seen to conform to the Christian faith, and was known broadly and used in the churches, and so it made it in. But hey, just to start off with, what's the source of the misreading? When does this book get crazy, and what to avoid? Because there are crazy readings of this book pretty much in every century, every Christian century, including our own. And it comes from whenever this book is put together with the conspiracy thinking of any age. We've had our own experience in America very recently of conspiracy thinking, where people are told, "Hey, things aren't what they appear to be. There's secret cabals out there who are acquiring power, and they want to hurt you." This sort of thinking exists almost everywhere, and this book is vulnerable to being co-opted into conspiracy thinking, and that's where you get some really crazy Christian readings, and that's not what this book is really about, and so that's something to watch out for. And we wanted part of tonight is decoupling this book from any sort of reading that says, "Hey, this is what's secretly going on in politics, or how this is going to play its way out in the future." That's bad. The English title comes from the Latin Revelation, but it's originally written in Greek, like the rest of the New Testament. And one of the key things to notice is that it's singular. There's a single revelation. Part of how you know whether somebody understands this book or not, who's talking about it, is anyone who talks about the book of Revelations doesn't understand the book. Like, you have to, it's singular. It tells you very clearly what it is. The verb, it comes from the verb, for Greek people, apokalypto, which literally means uncovering. And it's what it's not is, this is the Revelations reading. It's not a chronological series of historical events. Instead, it's a single unveiling of Jesus Christ as Lord, which is exactly what it says in the very first words, which is where the title comes from, which is how ancient titles work anyway. It says the revelation of Jesus Christ. So there's a single revelation, and it's Jesus Christ in his fullness, not just his partial, the partial vision you might receive in maybe only following him around Galilee. So what the title means when you hear the book of Revelation, it doesn't mean the revelatory historical events of the future. It's the true meaning of the identity of Jesus Christ. And that's the revelation. That's the apocalypse. That's the unveiling. This is what it wants you to see. And so any reading that doesn't give you that is a misreading of the book. And I said it's a widely misread book, but that's how it is. It's so anyway, it sounds a little crazy, doesn't it? It's not a book that it's not a very Anglican book, just to be frank about that. It's because Christianities differ from each other in there's kind of basically two kinds of Christianity anywhere from any century. There's a religion of Christianity is a religion of salvation, meaning the prayer for that kind of Christianity is, "Lord, rescue me." That's the Christianity of salvation, very legitimate. But there's also Christianity as a way of life, meaning, "Lord, teach me how to live well in this world." And these Christianities live side by side. Revelation is a Christianity of salvation. It's, "Lord, rescue me." Anglican theologies historically have been way of life theologies, and we're magnificent at them. You know, the common prayer as a way of making your way in the world as a shared community. I mean, that's kind of what we're historically way of life people. And so this Christianity is thoroughly within the canon, meaning it's in the realm of acceptable Christian theologies, but it's not the one it's not a big Anglican driver. and that's part of what's kind of fun about talking about it tonight, because it's thoroughly Christian, but it's not what we do on Sunday mornings. And when we're reading some passages, I don't know how far you got in the book, but you don't have to get very far where you're like, I don't think we hear a lot of this in church on Sunday mornings. I think church would be more exciting if we read more of this book. You get it when it does show up in the lectionary. There are little snippets that in the Easter season, and so you'll probably hear some of it this coming Easter. But just to get, for those of you who maybe didn't read it, maybe we read a little passage right now, just so you can hear the kind of un-Anglican idiom of it all. But hey, Michael, did you get my email about maybe reading a little bit of it for us?
Yes, I did, and I'd be happy to do so. So, friends, this is chapter 12, the first 12 verses, and it is really powerful language, and I will read it in a powerful way. Mm-hmm. And a great portent appeared in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth, in anguish for delivery. And another portent appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems upon his heads. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars in heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. She brought forth a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. With her child, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, in which to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and is called Satan, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they have loved not their own lives, even unto death. Rejoice then, O heaven, and you that dwelt with therein. For woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short.
Yeah, so, hey, thank you. James, you have a question?
Yeah, what translation was that? It was a little different than the NRSV.
Oh, and Michael, you were muted.
Sorry, that was the RSV. I
Oh, okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A few things have changed when they revised it, I guess.
But it still it captured the meaning and the idiom and this Revelation has that sort of very powerful, grand imagery throughout. It's really quite consistent with that, and how different it is from, even though we had some objections to St. Paul on gender roles when he's like, hey, this is how women should wear their hair, and not like this and not like that, and there's none of that. Like, it's a whole different world, isn't it? Than those mundane little pastoral issues in Paul's congregations. And so I think the immediate question is like, why this strange mode of writing, right? Like, how do we get it? It's and kind of what changed, because the Book of Revelation seems to come from kind of on the other side of 70 AD, which was a really big deal for Christians and Jews. Because what happened was, like, if you read Paul, like Romans chapter 13, and you talk about the Romans, Paul's like, hey, I'm a Christian, Jew, and a Roman citizen. Like, and they all go together in a way that makes sense to me. And the Romans, largely they try to, they build roads, aqueducts, have a general rule of law that Christ is happy to use, punish evildoers. It's working out. The Roman Empire is a kind of benign force in Romans chapter 13, but things take kind of a harsh turn in the 60s. You've probably heard of the Emperor Nero, no friend of the Christians, but also pretty erratic. Like, he murdered his mom, got rid of his wife in favor of his mistress until he murdered her too, and he executes Peter and Paul, the two biggest kind of Christian leaders. Lights a famous fire, as you probably know, to clear land for his own palace. And Christian persecution becomes an increasing pattern for Christian experience, in that the Romans they didn't like new religions. They liked order more than anything else. And when you're an empire and you have colonies, you just want order, and that's what they wanted. And as long as Christianity was a form of Judaism, it was protected as an old religion. The more it started being perceived as not Judaism, but something else, then the more it became vulnerable as being just some new Eastern cult that is just going to cause unrest and deserves to be persecuted. And so Christians' experience ended up being more and more an experience of being vulnerable to political persecution. And but Judaism also had its own quest for autonomy, and by AD 70, the Romans invade the land of Israel and burn the temple to the ground. I mean, they light a fire so hot that the stones the temple is made out of catch on fire. Like, they burn it to dust, and to make a point. And Christianity is, right, that's the temple of Jesus. That's where all our stories of this is. They slaughter tens of thousands of Jews to disperse this whole thing. And so anyway, the world turns out to be, for Christians, a less safe place. And this is the environment that this book comes out of. And so the author of this book adopts an idiom that's well known. It's a genre that we're unfamiliar with, but it was familiar to a lot of people, and it already appears in the Bible earlier. So Daniel 7-12, but also there are all these other books out there. If you go looking for them, there's the Apocalypse of Ezra, the Apocalypse of Baruch, the Apocalypse of Moses, Enoch, And after the book of Revelation, they keep being written. So there's an apocalypse of Peter. And this is it's a kind of code that is actually pretty easy to understand. If you read all these books, when you have a beast, then the beast is a kind of nation. If the horns on the beast's head are rulers, so when there's a horn that rises, it's a ruler, and it's not something not understandable. Once you understand the code and you read them, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. And so the book of Revelation isn't actually very cryptic. You can, if you, with some study and some historical context, you can kind of understand the whole thing, and what it means. And it's not some secret code about the future. It's a very understandable book that addresses its own time, just like every other book of the Bible. It just takes its own work. And one of the themes from the class, I think, for understanding hard sayings is to think in terms of genres. Like, if it's a poem, then read it like a poem. If it's a letter, read it like a letter. Like, who's it from? Who's it to? What's the context? And if it's an apocalypse, then read it like, oh no, something terrible's happening, right? And because if you're writing in that, if you're writing an apocalypse, you're writing in tough times. But it has its own purpose. As I've said in earlier classes, the most important question isn't to find the one right meaning. It's to find what is the purpose of the book? What's it supposed to do to you as a reader? Like, what's the Holy Spirit going to accomplish? And that's the right question for all the Bible, but it's also the right question for the book of Revelation. And the writer of the book of Revelation says very clearly what the book's about and why you should read it. And so here it is. In my words, the purpose of the book of Revelation is to encourage faithful, nonviolent resistance to dominant opposition amid hazardous circumstances. So faithful, nonviolent resistance to dominant opposition, meaning what's opposing you is way more powerful than you, but amid hazardous or dangerous circumstances. In the words of the writer of the book of Revelation, this is chapter 3:10. He says, "Because you've kept my message of endurance," right? The message of endurance, "I will keep you safe in the time of trial that is going to come to the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming quickly. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may take your crown." So hold fast, endure with love. Don't fight back violently. It's not a book that wants you to fight a war with the Romans the way the Jews in Jerusalem fought against the Romans in a losing cause. That's not the stance of the book. The book says when you're under attack, then fight back with love, and you can do that by cultivating a certain worldview or a certain subjectivity, and that's a lot of what this book's about. And so there is like one of the themes. Part of why this book is crazy is because it has three sort of dualisms in it, which is dualisms meaning it divides experience. That I think if you're pretty normal and sane, you have an experience of the world as one thing, not two. Whereas this book splits the world up into opposing twos in three different ways in every minute, and it wants you to experience the world through three layers of duality. So one of them is there's a temporal dualism, meaning your experience of time is split there between the present and the future. The every single moment of the present is in fact over against the future. And so if you're suffering in the present, you are completely aware of its discontinuity with the future, because you know, oh hey, there's this other reality out there besides my experience of present time, and that's future time. And future time is this world of divine judgment. And judgment is, we tend to think of judgment as a bad thing, but in fact, when you're suffering injustice, you want your day in court. You want justice. And if you're longing for justice, then the judgment isn't a bad thing. What's a bad thing is not being able to get a court date, where you're like, no, the court's not going to hear your case. You're never going to get justice here. And so, there's a future court date, and when you're looking at Nero, you're like, oh no, I know you're thinking, it's looking good for you now, Mr. Nero, but I know something you don't know. The future is impinging on the present. So a form of an experience of time where there's a split between the present and the future. There's also a split in your experience of space, meaning there are two realms. There's the earthly realm, but there's also the heavenly realm. And the earthly realm is much more contingent and temporary and weak. And the heavenly realm is where all the substance and force is. And so when you're looking at something in the world that maybe is negative, unjust, bad, it's just a lot less real than the real thing, which is the heavenly reality. And so you're focusing on the future. You're also focusing on the heavenly. It doesn't mean the present isn't real, and it doesn't mean the earth isn't real, but it does mean that the present and this physical world is going to give way. The other kind of dualism is there's a split in our moral lives between what is good and evil. There's and they're radically distinct. They don't really blur into each other. Because they represent two different powers. This is the language of Satan, and the devil is very prominent here. And there is a cosmic struggle between the two. But they're not equals. Like, there are plenty of philosophies out there where good and evil balance each other. That's not the message of this book. Evil is a poser. Evil is just fake. Evil is completely destroyed in like a pup. And I mean, God just works with evil, and the devil in his way is like a puppet. And that's part of what you get out of this book is you see this. There's a strong sense of ethics, a strong morality, but there's also a strong sense that good is sovereign. And so even though evil might have its temporary earthly victories, including like if you're arrested and you are on your way to martyrdom, which is a big theme in this book, then even if you are tied up and you're about to be executed, if you've read this book and it's had its effect on your soul, you are just having great compassion with your persecutors, because you're like, oh, I feel so sorry for you, because in killing me, blood is on your hands. Like I'm actually, like, history's on my side. I'm not killing anybody. I'm like, and so your response to dying and suffering and persecution is one of love. But that's some pretty serious mental gymnastics, isn't it? Like what this book wants to do to you. And this is partly why I started off saying I think it's a dangerous book, because I'm not sure you really want to live in that headspace in all contexts. But I think that the context it brings out is a real one, and it's a if the Bible is a pharmacy, like I said, like each book is its own sort of cure for the soul. This is the kind of book that if you were kidnapped by extremists who had locked you up in a hole, like these things happen, right? Like think about all these like Nigerian kidnappings that are happening that break our hearts, of the school children that are taken captive. Like these things happen all over the world. And what sort of strong medicine do you have to persevere and endure and not give up, which is the message of this book. And this book is an excellent place to go if you are really in crazy town. Like this is in crazy circumstances, this is a strong medicine. And I think that's partly why it hasn't it's not so mainstream Anglican, in that we've had often some in our prior history as the nation of England and its western colonies, we've had a lot less of that as Anglicans. But these days the Anglicanism is more Anglicans live in Africa than anywhere else. We have Anglicans are in a lot of different places, and so maybe there is a moment where there's going to be an Anglican reading of the Book of Revelation, and so it's worth knowing about. But the spiritual practice of reading the Book of Revelation is meant to cultivate that aspect of your soul. Hey, just a word about its order. It is. Have you ever noticed that in the Bible? You'll see this when we're doing the Psalms a lot, when it says, you know how it'll have one sentence, then it'll have the next sentence, and they actually largely repeat, like where it says, create in me a clean heart, O God, which is one sentence, and then when we're saying the response, it says, and renew a right spirit within me. It's a form of Hebrew poetry where the second line repeats the first line, but in different words, and advances the notion a little tiny bit. And you have that in the Psalms all the time. Well, that is exactly how this book is structured. And so but it doesn't go in twos, it goes in sevens. This book loves 7. And why it loves 7, right? Because Bible numbers would be our own class, because Bible numbers are not our numbers. The Bible, it does crazy things with numbers, and one of the things that makes it crazy with numbers is each biblical letter is actually a number, because they do their numbers with letters. And so you can add up any biblical word. This is why in the Book of Revelation it says, he that have understanding reckon the number of the beast, because it is a human number. The number is 666. And it can do things like that with because the letters all add up to things. So anyway, the Bible numbers are really they're their own subject matter. But 7 means a complete cycle, because you have the creation in 7 days. The number 6 is the human number, right? Because human beings were made on the 6th day. And so we can go kind of on and on about the meaning of Bible numbers. But this is partly why when people are adding up numbers and trying to put them into contemporary science, why it doesn't work. Because the Bible is doing its own thing with numbers. But 7, so it's cycles of 7. And so there are 7, there are 7 cycles in this book, and the world kind of ends in each one. And if you try to make them chronological, it doesn't make any sense at all. Because basically the world ends, the bad people are punished, justice happens, and the good people are blessed and rewarded. And then you start over, and you do it over and over and over again, just to make sure you understand. So there are chapters 4 to 7 are the breaking of the 7 wax seals of judgment. 8 to 11 are the 7 trumpets of judgment. Um, then there's this special story that we read with about the woman who gives birth to the child, and it changes everything, which we'll talk about a little bit. 7 bowls of wrath, 5 and 16, where the wrath just poured out like a bowl upon the earth. Anyway, it just keeps going. But I'll just to prove my point, like here, I'll read a little bit of this is Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. So this is the right after the letters in chapters 1 to 3 that are like a prologue. That this is the punishment of the wicked. It says, when he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell on the earth. And as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. So the whole earth is shaking, like the stars are falling from the sky, like if you were shaking a fruit tree. How terrifying. The sky vanished like a scroll, rolling itself up, the whole sky. And the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks and the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? By the way, so sky's rolling up, stars falling from the sky. Everybody's terrified of the Lamb. I mean, and do you notice how like we kind of get used to the language of the lamb? But isn't that, have you ever seen a lamb? Like that's the terrifying thing. Like, why would the whole world be afraid of the lamb? But that's the end of this. That's the end of a cycle, right? There's no stars. There's no sky. It's over. And then the next chapter's on the blessing of it. And so the meaning of this book is actually just the plain meaning of the gospel. If you stray far from that, because the Lamb, of course, that's terrifying, is the Lamb of God, as John the Baptist said, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." It's pointing to Jesus, and Jesus is that Lamb. And even that story that we started off with the woman in childbirth, if you look at it, it's simply the story of the gospel that you've heard over and over again. Though the woman clothed with the sun, think about it as Mary, but this time the bearer of all of Israel's hope, who's opposed by the dragon that's lying in wait. And think of Herod. Remember Herod and slaughtering the innocent babies and hunting after the family. The family flee. She gives birth to this son who's destined to rule. That's Jesus in Bethlehem. That's our Christmas story. They have to flee. And remember, they flee to Egypt, and we have the flight to Egypt. This is all part of a giant cosmic struggle that culminates in the conquering of the Lamb, conquering the world by the shedding of its blood. It's simply the story that we know from the gospel, and it's just ratcheted up into some sort of crazy language. But if you think about almost any of it, you'll get any of the series. You'll think, if you pay attention, you'll hear it as the plain meaning of the gospel and not something else. So before I open it up a little bit, just some concluding remarks. So this book is really a book of consolation and encouragement. It's not a book really that's predicting the future, other than the fact that it predicts that there will be justice and for all of us, and the wrongdoing will be punished, and faithfulness and fidelity will be blessed. The book wants you to see that the victory of salvation is already there and done because it's willed where it matters, meaning in the future, in heaven, by good, in terms of the dualisms, and that's a done deal, and that you can have great confidence going forward. The book is an incredibly violent book, but notice that all the violence happens by divine agents. That violence makes it possible for you to be nonviolent and to stay true to the teachings of Jesus. Christians don't have to defend themselves because God is ultimately sovereign, despite appearances. But you have experienced the unveiling, the disclosure, so you know what other people don't know. And the resurrection really matters in this book. It's very strong at the end. There's a new Jerusalem with resurrected bodies where the Lamb of God lights up the whole city rather than the sun. And Christ is the light for all. And it is in the theme that is I think most neglected in this book that people don't notice is its theme of praise. And praise and worship are throughout this book as a form of political resistance and spiritual sustenance. There are all sorts of hymns in this book. Like here's Revelation 4:8. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. Here's another one. Since we've been doing morning prayer, which people had kind of fallen out of use. The pandemic has given us more morning prayer. We've used this one in morning prayer, but this is a Revelation 4:11 and 5:9 to 10 and 13 that appears in our morning prayer service. Splendor and honor and kingly power are yours by right, O Lord our God, for you created everything that is, and by your will they were created and have their being. And yours by right, O Lamb that was slain, for with your blood you have redeemed for God from every family, language, people, and nation, a kingdom of priests to serve your God. And so to him who sits upon the throne and to Christ the Lamb be worship and praise, dominion and splendor forever and ever. And anyway, there are a lot more in these, and it has this astonishing level of violence that is supposed to empower you to be nonviolent, alternating with these beautiful hymns that have stayed within the Christian tradition, which is your human response to from the book of Revelation. It's your human response to suffering. You respond to suffering with praise, which is a great kind of spiritual challenge of the book. But so I think I'm gonna stop there, because if I start getting into everything else from there, I think I could get pretty deep into some weeds. Like the interpretation of the 1,000-year reign, which is in fact the church age. It's not 1,000 years kingdom that we build through our own human acts, which is one of the worst forms of American Christianity that exists, is where we build this 1,000-year kingdom. And that's supposed to be America. That is not it. It's the whole church age, and where evil is somewhat circumscribed because of the power of the gospel. Anyway, there's a lot of little details, but I'm not going to go through all of them. But I'm happy to answer any questions about some of them. So anyway, what do you guys think about the apocalypse? Yeah, Chris.
I just wanted to observe that I think perhaps one of the temptations to the misreadings that you described at the beginning of this is that Revelation comes at the end of the New Testament. And so it's a reasonable assumption in most books that the last chapter would be, well, here's what happens at the end,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to sort of impose a chronology on it. I don't, although it does make sense in the way that you're describing the purpose of the book, it also makes sense to come at the end, but then it presents that risk. I'm not so sure where else it could go. What comes to mind is maybe between Acts and Romans, so that you get all excited reading Revelation, and then Paul could calm you down and bring you back to reality.
That's really funny. I think if there was an Anglican canon, it's probably a good thing that the Anglicans didn't put together the Bible. But yeah, we totally would. Like, hey, we'd get you all excited, and then we would calm you right down to like, hey, that we got the big picture, but really, like, let's get to some pretty mundane ethics here. Yeah, because
Stay calm and be Anglican, and make a good bumper sticker.
Yeah, exactly. Because that would be. You're right. That's how we would do it. Because this ends with the early Christians put this thing together with a big round of excess.
Yeah.
So I just want to point that out.
Janet.
Maybe the Anglican way is the English way.
Oh, we still have we have varying opinions about that, but that is very true. We have our our English founding sticks with us in all sorts of ways. Yes.
Yeah. And keep calm and carry on.
Yeah. And they and so that fits some parts of the New Testament a lot better than others. And yeah, the Book of Revelation doesn't have a lot of calm in it. Yeah, Dave.
I had really never read much Revelation. Obviously, I'd heard of the passages in church and whatever here and there, like you say, but to sit and read it all in one fell swoop was amazing. I got about halfway through it, and I started thinking, I wonder what kind of mushrooms grow on the island of Patmos when John was there, because there's some weird stuff coming out of here. It was just really interesting to just sit down and read it all and try and make some kind of sense out of it.
Well, good for you though, putting the time into it. Because I mean, the Bible it's a good book, but it does have John's really. He's taking up this language like from Daniel's if you read Daniel chapter 7 to 12, that is at least its literary context is the Babylonian exile. So once again, it has all the key ingredients, right? The dominant power, the Empire of Babylon, where we have no power to change things. It has the same context in it, and then it transplants that. And so that's one source of language. And then the other source of language is, for those of you who are really like deep into, like, you want to really like figure something out of the Bible, it's a very creative retelling of the book of Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel has this starts off with this throne scene of just like Revelation with the picture of God. And then it moves towards a description of the temple. But it's the Jerusalem temple. And this in the book of Revelation, it's also this throne scene, and then it's the Jerusalem temple, but it turns out to be a new Jerusalem that is not the worldly city destroyed by the Romans, but it's a dominant heavenly city that we all belong to. And notice that the image in the book of Revelation of salvation is the notion of a city. Because it's only worth pointing out, because we Americans love we love our individualism, and we love our individual liberty. And we also, American Christianities love kind of me and my Bible. And we don't really, our American Christianity isn't such, it's not, it doesn't emphasize, one of its weaknesses is our great awakenings where you accept Jesus into your heart don't usually form cities. Like the dominant vision of this book is the saved form a city. And that city is governed by love, which allows them to the image of light in the darkness, meaning that there's a kind of transparency where they can see each other as they are without secrets and without hiding and without defenses. And everyone's hearts are transparent to everyone else's heart illumined by the light of the Lamb. And they have this experience of community and togetherness. And that is a remarkable vision. And that is the city of peace, which is, Ir HaShalom, the Jerusalem word. And so it's a rereading of the book of Ezekiel. And I think it's also a very challenging, it's a strong challenge to our American version of Christianity that has a lot of virtues. I mean, Christianity is an individual thing that you're responsible for. And the primary question is, have you accepted Jesus as your Savior and Lord as an individual? Has some real power to it, and it's worked for our country. But we shouldn't necessarily think that that's the end of the biblical story, because the end of the Bible culminates in a city. And I think that's a strong challenge to us as Americans, and I think we could do a lot better with a community, and to think of the end of the story is an experience of togetherness, where we have no secrets from one another because we have nothing to hide. And we have nothing to fear. Is the end of the story. And so there's some serious good theology going on even in this. Just because something's dangerous doesn't mean it's bad, but it does mean it's dangerous. Yeah, Connie.
From what I read at the beginning, and I'm curious about your thoughts, this is not the gospel writer John. This is some other person named John, but we don't really know exactly who he was. Mm-hmm. What light can you shed on that?
Well, there are a lot of that's right, that we many things in the Bible are, when you want to do some rigorous history, are pretty unclear. They're clearer than most other ancient things. Like if you just get into like you start doing history from a couple thousand years ago, the amount of evidence for things we think we know is a lot less than we realize. And so the Bible is actually, there's more history for the Bible than almost anything else. But yes, the actual identity of this biblical writer, but there are a lot of biblical books where the authorship is tricky, and the authorship of the whole book is often tricky because sometimes parts of the book seem to be slightly later than other parts, and that's partly why I think it's part of my contention through this whole every class here is that the authority of books of the Bible do not depend on the author. The entire 66 books is authoritative, and we receive the whole as authoritative. And the meaning of the individual parts is determined by the whole. This is why you read the unclear passages, like the book of Revelation, in light of the clear passages. And this is why, I said that the meaning of the book of Revelation is the same as the Gospels, and so in the end, it doesn't matter that John of Patmos, maybe he wrote the book or maybe he didn't. And to me, it's a utterly irrelevant question because nothing is at stake in it. In the same way as the historical critics will tell you there are 3 Isaiahs because parts of Isaiah seem to be tied to later developments. And that is utterly irrelevant thing when it comes to interpreting a book for the Christian way of life. So this is anyway. So that's it. It wouldn't be any more authoritative if we knew for sure John the Apostle wrote it. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, because of where he was, Connie, and partly the way he talks, we know that he was part of one of the churches that Paul started. So he's in the Paul group, but he also knows a lot about the language of the John Christians, the disciples of that were connected to the Gospel of John. So he's drawing from both those traditions. I wanted to share this revelation that I had about this book, since we're talking about Revelation, right? I once went to a conference on apocalyptic literature. It was at the Greek Orthodox Seminary here in Boston, and they happened to have a display of a lot of abstract art from some other event that they had there, and I suddenly realized something. Where does apocalyptic literature come from? Where does Daniel come from? It comes from history. But it's history that comes to a point where it breaks open because it just can't work anymore. And nobody sees the pattern anymore. And they're going crazy because history has gone berserk for them. And the same thing happened. This is an old book, but the same thing happened in the 20th century with art. For those of you who are interested in art, you know that what happened after the World Wars and the Holocaust and everything was the appearance of abstract art. Because the old images weren't good enough to deal with all of the crazy, impossible things and terrifying things that happened. And it's interesting that the part about the code also works with art. Pablo Picasso once said, I don't speak Chinese, but I know Chinese as a language. And I also can tell you Cubism is a language because Cubism is code. And all of these apocalyptic writings are code. If you can read the code, then you know what we're talking about. Isn't it interesting that this whole thing happens again in art in the 20th century? So it isn't just confined to Rome. It's an eternal issue.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael, because the shattering events of the year 70 with, Israel, there was no land of Israel until from the year 70 till like 1947. I mean, we take for granted that the state of Israel, but it's brand new. And for the 90% of Christian history, the temple and all that was gone, and Israel was never coming back. And now that the restoration of the state of Israel is something we're still trying to get our minds around in terms of like what it actually means in terms of the broader economy of God's working in the world. But it was a shattering event in the year 70. I mean, and Judaism as we knew it was maybe over. And what happened after that was a big surprise, but it wasn't so sure that Judaism was going to survive. And so, yeah, so I think it's a good analogy about just the shattering in the same way that the 20th century for people who take it seriously seems like the end of progress, with the genocides and the millions and millions and millions of murders. Yeah. James.
Yeah, actually having kind of as an outsider, but been around a lot of evangelical circles, where people actually take this very seriously in terms, like literally, where like there's a spirit, there's like a war we don't see happening in the heavens, and it's happening all around us all the time. And I that when I hear that kind of stuff, I kind of it seems so fantastical that I kind of like ignore it. Like my brain just kind of goes like, nope, I'm good with that. That doesn't help me, like, doesn't help me live my life, and it doesn't, make me understand others. And so basically, the thing I take away from this whole class is that oftentimes when we look at things really at face value, and look at it very literally, that's where you run into a lot of the problems. So that's what that's what I've taken away from this whole class. So.
Yeah, the alienation and resentment of the many evangelical American communities feel as being left out of the central currents of American culture, this book just feeds. And it's a kind of toxic dynamic that's bad for America and bad for them. And they really could do a lot better by reading this book in a better way. And it's not the book's fault. I mean, the book's claims about working towards a city through nonviolent love and is in enduring even in your left outedness, I think actually could lead to some good places, but it doesn't usually with them, and it just feeds and nurses this resentment that we see feeding into our politics. And yeah, you're right. This is in some parts of American evangelicalism. This book is the core book, and those dualisms that I laid out that this book wants you to adopt, they kind of look at it in this way. I mean, the giant struggle between good and evil is what they're doing, and then they identify evil, I think, way too bluntly. Yeah,
I want to say that though also I don't want to lump all evangelicals together, because I've also experienced some very beautiful things within those circles as well, especially how they get together and like we are doing and discuss the Bible. They're very good about that. Like they sit down and everyone gets to say their piece, and yeah.
Oh, and there's certainly some smart readings of the Book of Revelation coming along with them. Yeah, we're hoping to bring them along with us. Hopefully, yeah. So anyway, let's see a little bit. Okay, one more. Janet has one thing, and then we have Michael, and then I think we'll call it a day.
Oh, I just wanted to say I have always loved Revelation. But first, it was for the imagery and the drama, and then the songs of praise. I love those. And then more recently, as I read it more, I've come to the thankfulness that it shows how the good ultimately triumphs and God is in control. And I'd like to say with regard to evangelicals, when I'm in England, I go to my sister's church, which is an evangelical Baptist church. And sometimes I go and look on their website and I check in with some of the lectures and things that they've been doing. And the pastor there recently did a 3-part series on Revelation. So I listened to that. And I'm happy to say that basically he has said exactly what you've been saying this evening. So there's lots of good evangelicals out there who feel the same way.
The church is bigger than Anglicanism, thank God, and Jesus is working with all of us, and hopefully we end up in the same city in the end. So, Michael, did you have one last comment, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the simple reading of the book usually comes down to identifying the characters, and I remember very clearly when Walter Mondale was identified as the Antichrist. This stuff is always going to happen, and it's perennial. It's never going to stop, I don't think. Thank you, Paul, for a wonderful class.
Oh, hey, you're welcome. And that Walter Mondale comment was like where I began with. Whenever Revelation connects with conspiracy thinking, you get a bad reading. Yeah, and it's happened in every century. But yeah, that we want to keep it away from conspiracies and stick to the plain meaning of the gospel as it comes to us in this in wonderful idiom like Janet was describing, that it's a so yeah. So anyway, the Book of Revelation for Anglicans is one thing that what makes the world a better place is if Anglicans stick to our claim that the Bible's our book, because we do. We our prayerful way of life Christianity, I think, is good for the world, and we give away the Bible too easily to other by saying that it's not ours, and it is ours, and we do have our own prayerful reading of it, and that's I think good for the world and good for us. So so thank you, everyone. We'll at some point in the future, we have some other things to pursue next, but at some point in the future, I'm hoping we'll do a part 2 of this class, because we really just started on the scandalous readings. There's a lot more trouble in the Bible, and that we'll probably do another. It'll be pretty easy to get another 5 weeks out of it. So hopefully we'll pick this up sometime later. But thank you, everybody, and let's have a really good Easter. Okay. All right, bye. Bye, everybody.